Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the 2022 History Lecture Series. I'm Charity Urbanski, your host for this year's lecture series, and I'm delighted to have you joining us again this evening. As a reminder, tonight's lecture would be followed by a short question and answer period, and you can enter questions into the Q&A feature as you're watching the lecture. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that this event meets on the contemporary lands of the Duwamish, Suquamish, and Muckleshoot nations, and other Coast Salish peoples who call the waters and coastline of the Salish Sea home. Tonight, we're continuing with our theme of capitalism in action. Last week, we explored some of the crises of capitalism with Professor Mark Metzler. And tonight, Professor Anand Young will be taking us to China and India to explore regional capitalism through the study of tea. Professor Young received his PhD at the University of Virginia. He currently holds a joint appointment in the Department of History and the Jackson School of International Studies, and he teaches popular courses on South Asian and world history, as well as policy-related classes. While Professor Young began his career specializing in the history of colonial India, in recent years his focus has shifted to become more comparative and more global, and he's mainly focused on connections involving India, China, and other world regions. Professor Young's first book, The Limited Raj, Agrarian Relations in Colonial India, examined economic and political relations between the peasantry, landowning elites, and British colonists in Bihar, India during the 19th century. His second book, Bazaar India, Markets, Society, and the Colonial State in Bihar, situates subaltern history in the world of commerce and culture. It highlights the economic, social, and cultural transactions that ordinary men and women engaged in to negotiate the market economy of colonial India. His most recent books are Empire of Convicts, which narrates the laboring stories of Indians who were banished to penal colonies in Southeast Asia for their criminal and/or political activities, and an annotated translation of 13 Months in China, a remarkable book written in Hindi by an Indian subaltern who helped suppress the Boxer uprising in China in 1900 to 1901. Professor Young is currently working on two book projects. One is on the North Indian labor diaspora across the Indian and Pacific Oceans and the Caribbean, and the second project is a memoir cum history of New Delhi in the early 1960s. For tonight's lecture, Professor Young will examine the history of capitalism in China and India through the study of one of Asia's most important commodities, tea. His talk traces the development of tea as a beverage of choice across the modern world and its growth as an industry in Asia. It offers a perspective on the rise of capitalism and globalization that highlights the social, cultural, and economic differentiations and distortions within the capitalist world system. Please join me in welcoming Professor Anand Young.
Thank you, Professor Urbanski, for that extremely fulsome introduction. What an honor to be part of the History Lecture Series. And thank you, Josh Apfel and Richard and others who always make sure that the History Lecture Series goes on, rain, shine, or pandemic. I wish I were lecturing in person in front of a sea of caffeinated tea aficionados, but Zoom will have to do for now. Tea, the second most consumed beverage in the world after water, has been a constant and invigorating presence in my life. It has, because I was born and grew up in India of Chinese parents who migrated there to pursue Buddhist studies. And as an adult, I've spent big chunks of my scholarly life in archives in and around London, fueled by endless cups of tea. China, Britain, and India figure prominently in this talk that emphasizes the intersections in their tea histories to highlight the workings of and synergies between capitalism and imperialism in the modern world. Their individual and interconnected stories also point to the different historical trajectories of capitalism. So why do commodity history? Tea is the perfect commodity through which to narrate larger stories, or to recycle a well-known phrase from a famous anthropologist. tea is good to think with. Its economic, social, and cultural biography calls to mind Marx's telling observation about commodity fetishism, about the ways in which things attain almost mythical or mystical or spiritual essence and transcend use value as they become commodified and tied to money and other commodities and not to the labor that produced them. Tea's career also outlines the far-flung connections that commodities and capital created in the modern world and the economic, social, and political dynamics in the makings of global capitalism and empires. Professor Metzler's excellent lecture last week briefly alluded to one of those relationships in citing Eric Williams' classic work on capitalism and slavery that rightly considers the forced mobilization of enslaved African labor in the Caribbean plantation economy as key to the rise of capitalism and the British Empire. As my next slide, featuring 3 book covers illustrates, commodities can be deployed to narrate many big stories. And so books you may be familiar with about cod, indigo, and the Kalashnikov. So can reading tea leaves, so to speak, as the next set of images suggest. Erica Rappaport's book on how tea shaped the modern world, the McFarlane's book about the remarkable history of the plant that took over the world, and the multi-authored book about the Asian leaf that conquered the world. Notice world is very much present in the title of all these books. My talk opens with China, where tea was a niche drink for about 1,000 years before it became widespread in a market and population the size of Europe, and an economy that was one of the, if not the most prosperous in the world until the early modern period. Debates among scholars today is not about the prowess of the Chinese economy, but when the great divergence happened. In other words, when did Europe catch up and pull ahead? No one says before 1500. Most people go 1500, 1600, some even argue 1700 or even 1800. Professor Metzler's lecture very helpfully touched on the sprouts of capitalism that were already present during the Tang and especially the Sung dynasties, also the period in which tea consumption spread via an extensive network of trade and markets. Rising international demand for tea, especially in the 18th and 19th centuries, increasingly enmeshed that industry in a global circuit of bullion and commodities and incorporated China's economy into the British-dominated world capitalist system. Its resounding defeat in the Opium Wars of the 1840s and 50s and the unequal treaties subsequently imposed on it by the Western powers initiated what many regard as a century of national humiliation, a period of semi-colonialism. I will turn next to Britain and its emergence as a tea drinking nation, a growing habit that made it dependent on China and on paying in silver. In the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the English East India Company and private traders reconfigured that system of exchange by adding India to the mix. The latter's revenue and products, namely opium, helping defray the costs of the trade imbalance. Thus began Britain's assault on China and its opium for tea trade. The British also sought to break China's tea monopoly by growing their own, namely by developing India firmly in their hands by the beginning of the 19th century into a vast tea garden. The emergence of the tea industry in South Asia organized in the form of plantation agriculture, depended on a coerced and semi-coerced racialized migrant labor force, constitutes the final section of the talk. The plantation mode of production in India offers a stark contrast to the Chinese system of smallholder tea farmers who persisted well into the 20th century, and also offers a striking parallel to the brutal labor regimes of plantation agriculture in the Caribbean. I begin with an image of the tea plant as meticulously drawn in the late 18th century, part of a European imperial project to command botanical knowledge of the wider world in order to dominate its people, places, and processes, along with its flora and fauna. Tea pronounced differently in different Chinese dialects, and the character for cha or te is up there. Also, tu, or as in bitter vegetable, all these pronunciations originating in Chinese lie at the root of most words used in most languages to refer to it. And as many of you know, depending on when the leaf is plucked, what kinds of fermentation and oxidation processes they undergo, and the provenance of the tea plant, tea really exists in a number of different varieties. Oops. The tea plant, which can be in the form of bushes and trees, is native to the region straddling South China, India, Burma, Thailand, Vietnam, as you can see here. People in these areas, and it's unclear who did this first, probably ingested it in some form or another in ancient times, but only in China did it become a regular drink. Initially in the southern areas of Yunnan and Sichuan, and its two big cities are underlined here in this map. I've also identified that part of Northeast India that is known as Assam, where tea plantations were developed in the early 19th century. This map doesn't include Ceylon or Sri Lanka, way in the south of South Asia, that also became an area of active tea plantations. According to Chinese mythic history, tea dates back to one of its legendary culture heroes, the divine husbandman, or the mythological emperor Shennong, who accidentally discovered tea in the 3rd millennium BCE when leaves from the tea plant fell into a cauldron of boiling water. Historical records suggest that small numbers of people, primarily in the South, imbibed tea, often mixed with other substances, prior to or during the Han Dynasty, which lasted between 3rd century BCE and 3rd century CE. And as I note up there, it really started out as a Southerner's drink. From the outset, it was associated with having medicinal properties along with being a pleasurable kind of drink. And for some people, it was also in lieu of drinking alcohol. And it was at the outset extremely expensive, so appropriate not for commoners, but for rulers and the wealthy. Early adopters of tea probably included Buddhist monks and Buddhist communities who found it helpful in their meditation, including in keeping them alert. And these early users were well aware, much as today's scientific literature seems to suggest, that tea has positive associations with good health and longevity. Liu Yu's Classic of Tea, published around 780 CE in the late Tang Dynasty, represents an important milestone in the history of tea because it signals the arrival of tea, and its publication also suggests that it helped promote or further promote the drinking of tea. An orphan brought up by a Buddhist monk, he wrote his book to inform people about the how, what, where, and why of growing, producing, and drinking tea. No wonder he's celebrated as the god of tea. In the ensuing centuries, tea drinking continued to grow in popularity, increasingly becoming a staple item of dietary and cultural life in China. Its growing popularity is suggested by the rise of tea wares associated with tea drinking, tea houses, competitions, events, and new ways of preparing it. And one of the important developments is in the early 16th century, when roasted loose leaf is steeped in water instead of crushing and powdering, earlier ways of preparing tea. Tea then, and well into the 20th century, was produced by peasants, smallholder peasants, working tea bushes, typically on their uplands where they did not grow crops. The labor for its cultivation came from family members, unpaid family members, or if they needed, because they had larger crops, migrant seasonal workers, something that'll become more and more important when tea takes off because of international demand. The tea leaves were then processed in workshops in private homes, not by the peasant smallholders, but by others, and then came into the hands of specialists, traders, and merchants who were actively involved in its distribution across China. Among these traders and merchants were Buddhist monks on whose land tea grew. And remember, they were sort of early adopters of tea. Its popularity can be gauged by teaware that dates back to the Tang Dynasty, and these were recently excavated in China as well as in other societies. The teawares are also tell you whether it was used by commoners or whether it was mostly used by elites. And clearly from the materials presented here or shown here, this is mostly wealthier people can afford tea drinking in these kinds of utensils. A well-known painting from the Tang Dynasty of 10 court ladies having a musical concert, sitting at a table, drinking tea, again suggesting that yes, it is becoming popular, but it's popular at this stage largely with court ladies. And the next two images also reference the popularity of tea drinking. A stunning tea bowl from the 12th century with kind of a hare's fur decoration on it. And the brown and black colors in this vessel were designed to contrast with the chartreuse colors of tea whisked into white foam. And the next image is the famous Sung painter Liu Songnian, his composition of, notice it's both male and female tea vendors competing to see who could make the best tea. And I think there's also a child in this picture. So tea competition, tea made by a number of different vendors. Clearly what is happening is tea drinking is increasingly becoming more and more popular. Tea in this period is also in circulation beyond the frontiers of China into Inner Asia, into the different stans, into Mongolia, into Afghanistan, into Iran. And beginning in the 17th century, its distribution will range even further as European traders become involved in its commerce. Their exports rising steadily in the 18th century and booming after the Opium War of the 1840s and 50s. We know that international trade increasingly becomes important because in 1840, about 23% of China's tea production goes abroad. And between 1840 and 1911, it becomes more like 30 to 40%. What leads to this, what this boom in China's tea trade is the growing interest and the growing consumption of tea in Europe. I should add, and this is not just for Professor Metzler's ears, but for all of you who heard his emphasis on boom and bust, that tea also, as it becomes an international commodity, goes through enormous fluctuations in demand, leading to boom and bust cycles of various duration and intensity, one of which I will refer to later on. So Britain becomes interested in tea in the 17th and 18th century. They're relative latecomers to the tea party, so to speak. They're not exposed to tea, it is said, till 1662, when Catherine of Braganza of Portugal marries Charles II and introduces tea drinking at court. And by the end of the 17th century, tea drinking has become a fad in London. Other Europeans were familiar with tea earlier on. Jesuit missionaries had encountered it earlier in the 17th century. The Dutch began importing it earlier than everybody else. And in fact, by the late 17th, mid 18th century, tea was imported on a commercial scale. And the companies that were involved in importing it were the various East India companies associated with the English and with the Dutch. And these companies, of course, were the beginnings of multinational corporations, and the English East India Company representing the single largest multinational corporation, so to speak, of its time period. Over the course of the 17th, 18th, and early 19th centuries, new practices of tea consumption emerge, such as the idea of adding sugar to tea in the 18th century. Starts out as a fad with upper and middle classes and increasingly becomes popular society-wide in Britain in the 19th century. And of course, this increased consumption of sugar boosts sugar production and boosts sugar, sort of the growth of sugar in the Caribbean, which in turn enhances kind of the enslaved plantation labor economy that is at the heart of sugar production in the Caribbean. Later on, people in Britain start adding milk to it. In the beginning of the 19th century, but really across the 19th century, it becomes the national drink of Britain, increasingly replacing beer, cider, and ale, which were much more popular. And as in China, its medicinal properties are emphasized, and it's offered as a drink that cures everything from headaches to low libido. It was said to soothe the nerves and settle stomachs. And it is seen as invigorating the minds and bodies of people, something which is recognized and used as a way of helping workers more energetically which of course tea drinking also does by weaning them away from alcohol. And the next set of slides show the spread of the practice of tea drinking in Britain. And I don't know whether you can see the image on the left where the lady of the house is very closely guarding tea, which in the 18th century is still a very expensive commodity, and carefully apportioning it to the maid who's getting ready to serve tea to the rest of the family. And on your right, similarly, a family at drinking tea, and given the kinds of vessels they're using and their own, the way they're dressed, this is not the tea, this is not a popular drink that ordinary people are drinking quite yet. But by the beginning of the 19th century, tea was well on its way to becoming the national drink. Its advocates, as I've already mentioned, praising its ability to invigorate bodies and minds, which makes it a drink that is not only to the taste of ordinary men and women, the working classes, particularly tea with sugar and increasingly with milk, but at the factory, tea breaks are encouraged because it's a way of making sure workers will continue to hunker down and work effectively. So the idea of granting tea breaks, 15 minutes at some point in the morning and another 15 minutes to have a sit down and have a cup of tea, as Brits are fond of saying. And you can see largely female workers here having that 15-minute break. This, the more aristocratic version of this, or the more upper class version of it, is the way it changes dining practices, although eventually that catches on across the classes, is kind of having the low tea and the high tea breaks over the course of the day. And British dietary practices or dining practices going from 2 meals a day to having 2 interludes where people have tea with various kinds of accompaniment. All those people in Britain indulging in a cuppa several times a day, and increasingly so, explains why tea consumption grew over the course of the 19th century, as you can see here in the 2 halves of this slide. On the left side, the growing exports of the East India Company. And the reason why the dates of the East India Company start falling off in the 1830s is in 1833, 1834, the East India Company loses its monopoly over the China trade, and all kinds of private traders and other individuals and companies enter into the China trade. But as you can see here, if you sort of look at export numbers, the dramatic growth over the course of the 18th century, from 156,000 pounds at the beginning of the 18th century to almost 20 million by the end of that century, and in the next 3 decades, growing substantially between 1800 and 1830, almost by another 50%. And on your right, you can see some of the consumption figures of how much tea people drank over the course of the 19th century. Tea was, for the East India Company and for tea traders, immensely profitable, even though the price of tea initially was quite high because of the import duties imposed on tea and also the cost of shipping, But as faster ships came in and as duties fell and more people consumed tea, the price of tea over the course of the 19th century falls very dramatically. I'm not going to get into kind of the East India Company 19th century story of how carefully they calibrated how much tea they imported into Britain. These numbers are not tea that went to Britain, but also other parts of Europe and other parts of the world where they were exporting. How careful the East India Company was in making sure that it didn't import too much to have prices drop so that it could not make the killer profits it was making in the tea trade. So there's a lot more than these numbers show you. The huge interest in tea was all rooted through after 1760 through the port of Canton of Guangzhou. And in this kind of synoptic depiction, you can see the countryside from where the tea is coming into Canton, into the warehouses, from where then merchants and brokers would then pass on the tea that were sold to the various companies. An illustration gives you a sense of the warehouses into which tea was aggregated. And so there are several layers of middlemen operating between the peasant householder and the East India Company, with the profits growing kind of at every stage, and merchants and brokers really making the most money out of what was a very lucrative trade in tea. And the growing international demand reflected in these numbers will lead to extensification to tea cultivation in new areas of China. And as these numbers show you, how much tea is being exported, how much silver is coming in, and how the East India Company and private traders who were involved in the so-called China trade increasingly sought to balance the deficits in their trading system, because along with the outflow of silver, and even though they were making considerable profits from the tea trade, they tried to enhance those profits by adding something new to the mix. And that something new came from India, that by the beginning of the 19th century was firmly in the hands of the British. That by the late 18th century, the British controlled vast swaths of India. And by 1818, its control was consolidated all over India. And what they introduced was a triangular trade system where they started replacing payment in silver with opium. And as you can see here in these numbers, chests, with each chest weighing 140 pounds, how dramatically the opium trade to China grew, from 1,000 chests in 1773 to 10,000 chests in the 1820s. And on the eve of the Opium War in 1839, 40,000 chests of opium, and multiply that 40,000 by 140 pounds, and then multiply each of those pounds by ounces to get a sense of how many ounces of opium is out there, turning many cities and many people in China into opium addicts. So a representation of this triangular trade. And what this growing demand for Chinese tea, and what we have to keep in mind here is that in the world commodities market until the early 19th century, China has a virtual stranglehold. They are the only source of tea for the world. And as international demand grows, one of the ways they try to meet that enhanced demand is through extensification, through adding areas where tea was grown, so additional areas in central and South China, also Taiwan, where tea planting grew. Wastelands and wooden terrain became new areas of cultivation. Even some of the croplands were used for tea planting. The great expansion in the tea trade made some people very wealthy, silver owners as they were called, mostly landlords and merchants, but also small handfuls of peasants. And many have rightly argued that the enrichment of these kinds of people in an otherwise traditional agricultural landholding and peasant cultivation system probably strengthened feudal landlordism. This is also a period in which, with the rise of the international demand and the introduction of new layers of middlemen in the tea trade, Buddhist and Taoist temples that were involved in the tea trade started losing out. What also happened at the top of the supply chain is more and more foreign firms, American and European firms, became dominant. Agency houses and banks that started dominating and controlling this tea trade at the higher levels, but at the bottom rungs, tea cultivation, tea production remained in the hands of petty producers. And it did not lead to, as is one kind of pattern in the capitalist development of agriculture, to the rise of large-scale farming. So China, in some ways, bucks what is a trend in some parts of the world in the rise of a capitalist large-scale farming. But what did change fundamentally, so no change in peasant production of tea, but what change did occur happened as a result of a new supplier. And as you can see in these figures, the new element is the emergence of India and Ceylon and later on Japan, but we'll focus mostly on India. India and Ceylon in South Asia becoming a major source of the tea that Britain and other parts of the world increasingly sought. And as you can see in these numbers, particularly dramatic, and if we broke it down further year by year, you would see that in the 1870s and 1880s, there's a key moment. And then of course, in the first decade of the 20th century, as far as China is concerned, because tea increasingly for the palates of Europe and Britain in particular come from India. There is a long story to how tea developed in India, almost an imperial tea story. And kind of the mini version of it is, first of all, extensive East India Company espionage and intrigue, where they're constantly sneaking people into China to collect seeds and plants to bring back to their botanical experiments in India and Britain. There's an individual named Robert Fortune who goes and returns with massive quantities of tea seeds and tea plants in the 1840s. But there's also the serendipity of discovering tea growing in the wild in Assam, this region in Northeast India that in the 1820s came into the hands of the British, acquired from Burma, with which Britain will fight a series of wars and end up controlling all of Burma. Tea that grew in the wild was used by some people in the area, but not really consumed the way Britain and China did. And so the wild tea that is grown is not deemed suitable for Western palates. And so many of the experiments conducted in this part of Northeast India is to figure out how to bring in Chinese seeds and Chinese plants and to grow them in Assam and maybe even to produce hybrid varieties so that they would fit in well with the tastes of Europeans. And over the course of the 19th century, along with the greater export of Indian tea, there's also massive advertising campaigns to make people familiar with this tea. So there's on the one hand, a critique, a lambasting of Chinese tea, condemning it for being adulterated, having all kinds of toxic substances in it. And then on the other hand, praising tea that came from India because it was reliable. If it was produced, packaged, peddled by Europeans. And not only was it safe and pleasurable, but it was also patriotic to drink this tea. And so a picture, I think, which epitomizes this notion of imperial tea. And an illustration from the late 19th century, which kind of elides the way tea is developed in India, namely a plantation system that parallels many of the elements of the plantation system that existed in the Caribbean. Tea plantations developing in an area where labor is scarce, where local labor is reluctant to work for the punishing wages that the British have to offer. So in the absence of local labor, British planters who have been granted vast tracts of land at very inexpensive prices, import coolie workers from drought-stricken areas who are of a different ethnicity than the local people and who work for these extremely low wages because, of course, they're fleeing the starvation areas they're coming from, and also to get from central and eastern India to Assam, they really had to undertake long journeys. And so very often these tribal peoples that came to Assam came as entire families. And there they entered into these indenture contracts, which also came into vogue in the 1830s in the Caribbean, because post-abolition of slavery, the enslavement of people, the workers that came in from India and other parts of Asia were also on sort of these indenture contracts. What also prevailed in this part of Northeast India and to other areas where tea plantations were introduced was the support of the state, a crucial element in the development of capitalism, a colonial state that introduced laws to help planters to recruit this labor, legal powers to arrest workers when they ran away, and extra legal forms of coercion to make sure that these workers stayed in place. And of course, tea planters, along with colonial rulers, were all Europeans. So lots and lots of parallels to the brutal labor regimes that existed in the Americas. But much of the 19th century and early 20th century, the tea from India was exported. Notice the figure there that even as late as 1930, 90% of the tea is exported. Very little of it is consumed locally by Europeans who lived in India and by a tiny Anglophile middle classes, urban-based, upper caste, middle class, English-speaking Indians, but really didn't catch on. It probably didn't help that many nationalist leaders, such as Gandhi, thought that the use of tea was something peculiar to China, but was not something native to India. And if people really wanted some sweet substance with milk and sugar, why not just drink milk and sugar rather than drinking tea, which he considered was also bad for consumption. So it didn't really catch on, but post-Depression slowdown in the sales of tea and the vast surpluses that tea traders had accumulated, the Indian Tea Market Expansion Board is created in India to try and sell tea to the 300 million thirsty throats that existed in India. Why not Indianize tea? Why not sell it to Indian customers? And so you see, beginning in kind of the middle of the 20th century, a vast campaign to encourage people to drink tea. It was healthy, as was always said about tea dating back to ancient China. It was a social drink. It brought people together, as we saw at tea parties in China, and as we saw in tea dances and tea gardens in Britain. And also to emphasize that it was a national beverage. After all, it was homegrown. And many of the images that you'll see in the next set of slides gives this image of feminized Indian modernity to help people learn how to prepare and drink tea. And what, of course, happens in this indigenizing process that occurs in the late 20th century is not only is tea widely advertised and drunk, and I mentioned railway stations, docks, market cities, where it's widely distributed, but also the idea of preparing tea, not by steeping tea leaves, but by boiling it for an extended period of time with water, milk, sugar, and spices, and also sort of a much more cut form of tea, so a much more cheaper form of tea, which was affordable for the palates of ordinary people, became the way tea was drunk, or what is known as chai. And you can see in these last set of images how tea is popularized in India, going from becoming a more middle-class drink to eventually becoming a drink of ordinary men and women as chai. So in the 1911 Lipton's tea advertisement, it's a brown woman serving tea to white people clustered around a table. And by 1947, at the time of India's independence, it is considered 100% Swadeshi, which means Indian, or from the country, self-country, or homegrown. And you can see in these advertisements where the audience, intended target audience, is other Indians who in these happy, bright, smiling pictures, tea drinking is normalized as something everybody should be doing. It's refreshing, it's reviving, an old kind of trope, fights fatigue, energizes people, and of course, it is special. So in closing, let me turn to an image of a chai wala, a tea seller, showing how tea became indigenized and how the travel of tea across different circuits, beginning with ancient China and ending up in 20th century, shows us kind of the synergies between tea, capitalism, and empires over the centuries, and the ways in which the workings of and varieties of capitalism differed across time, place, and the kinds of commodities that were involved. Thank you very much.
Anand, for that fascinating and really wonderful trip through the commodity of tea and its history. We have several questions that have come up during the lecture, so I will try to get to as many of them as possible. The first question we have is that one of our viewers would like to know whether the Chinese government tried to control the growing of tea and prevent its spread or its export as it did with silk production.
I don't know when in time the question refers to.
That's left a bit vague. Did they at any point attempt to control the growth and export of tea, the Chinese government?
No, they did not. They realized very early on that it was a tax earner from that. And starting the 8th century, there was a tax levied on tea. So kind of in the imperial period, the tea distribution was widely encouraged and took lots of different forms, from an overland trade with Inner Asia and with Russia beginning in the early 19th century to the increasing overseas trade that began in the 17th and 18th centuries. The only kind of restrictions were placed was during the Qing period, when China sought to control the unruly kinds of, or what it considered to be unruly traders, making demands on China by allowing them to spill over into a number of different ports. So in 1860, it compelled them to work through a monopoly merchant guild in Canton. But that only lasted till the first Opium War, when China lost, and the unequal treaty that was imposed on it afterwards opened up additional ports. And with each loss, more and more of China was opened up. So the government really couldn't control the trade in tea. Mm-hmm. The Republican government, the Kuomintang government, sought to promote tea because it had fallen on hard times with the rise of Indian tea. And when in the PRC, the tea trade was encouraged and perhaps did not become dormant during the troubles of the Cultural Revolution. On the contrary, very quickly, the tea industry revived. And today, of course, China is back up there at the top as one of the major tea producing nations of the world.
All right, so it's almost always been seen as a revenue producer rather than something that they attempted to contain. All right, let's see, the next question. Oh, why do you suppose Britain adopted tea to a much greater extent than other European countries, or is that simply a matter of our perception? Is that an actual, did they become much greater consumers of tea, the British?
Yeah, I think kind of the four contemporaneous stories, and there are probably any number of reasons why people went differently, is if you juxtapose Britain, France, the United States, and the Dutch, Britain became the most extensive user of tea. In part, it's also being promoted extensively. And one could ask, to what extent is it connected to the Industrial Revolution and the rise of mass production and factories much earlier than other parts of Europe, which led to the encouragement of tea drinking, not only to energize workers, but also wean them away from the heavy drinking that was the other form of consumption that many people in Britain did. Whereas in France, that never caught on. From the very beginning, there wasn't an interest in tea, nor did the government ever seek to promote it. The Dutch were kind of one of the first countries, along with Portugal, to export it. And there was a certain amount of tea drinking, but it didn't catch on. And perhaps it also didn't catch on because the other part of the story is what countries become coffee consumers and what countries become tea drinkers. And so both in the case of the Dutch and particularly the US, typically the traditional narrative is, and then the US became more coffee drinkers. That's only part of the story because the US still is one of the countries where tea consumption is, or the total tea consumption is quite high.
Right. And I actually have two follow-up questions that sort of dovetail nicely with that. The first is, when exactly is coffee introduced? Is it introduced a bit later than tea to Western Europe?
No, I think in fact, in certain parts of Europe, it's introduced earlier because of the whole institution of coffee houses that exist in the Ottoman period, from where they spread to Europe. So tea in some ways comes later because it is so much more it is so expensive that it is primarily in aristocratic circles for a very long time.
That makes a lot of sense. The other related question was, one of our viewers would like to know, did early Americans reject tea drinking because of the British tea taxes, or is that a myth from colonial American history? To what extent is that actually true?
We of course think of the Boston Tea Party, but that was more sort of chafing at the kinds of taxes that were imposed on it. And even in Britain, the ad valorem tax was really almost 100%. So the English East India Company is making millions and millions off of tea, even though the import duties are so high. I mean, part of the US story is, and you can think of many aristocratic families, or many of the early reputable families in the US who made their name, who made their killing in tea. And they made their killing in tea because they're competing with the British in developing these fast clippers to get over to China to come back with huge amounts of tea to sell to their customers.
Okay. All right, we have several questions left and not much time, so I'm going to try to be a bit strategic here. I think, well, one of the viewers would like to know if you could recommend a book on the topic of tea as a commodity.
As you saw from the 3 book covers, let's see if I can you still see my screen or not?
I'm not certain because I'm assuming we can. But yeah, those the 3 books that you, oh, there we go.
Whoops. You see that? The book covers?
Let's see. Yes. Well, we can go ahead and make sure that those are included on the website, or actually on the YouTube video as well. Because we are running out of time, let's see, I'd like to just go ahead and do one more question. Oh, can you talk a little bit about how the history of tea is connected to the history of the porcelain trade, or is it?
Absolutely connected, very much connected. So the growth of tea drinking leads to the popularity of developing the tea wares. So a lot of that comes in the wake of tea. Tea also early on is part of the European fascination with things Chinese, so part of the chinoiserie craze.
Mm-hmm.
So tea, porcelain, lacquerware, silk is all part and parcel of the same kind of fascination with why some people are interested in drinking tea. It's fashionable. It's a fad early on.
Right, right. And something that, as you mentioned, is also connected with elite status and the aristocracy. Wonderful. Well, since we are now past 7 o'clock, I think we will end it there. And I will thank you once again for a really wonderful lecture. And I'd like to remind everyone to join us again next week for Laura Halpern's talk, and then again in 2 weeks for a roundtable that will be hosted by Professor James Gregory. Thank you again so much, Anand, for a really, really wonderful lecture.
And thank you, one and all. Thank you for coming.
Yes, thank you all for joining us.